Well, I always get really impatient with people who consider negotiation a reward for bad behavior. You talk to the good as well as the bad. If we only negotiated with our friends, we would never get anywhere.
That's the voice of Rose Gottemoeller, one of today's guests on this week's Ukraine special for Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, listeners may not know this, but we have officially hit 200 episodes of Press the Button.
Hey, Lauren, great to see you as always. Yes, happy 200. It's hard to believe. It's been 200 episodes of covering breaking nuclear and national security news on a weekly basis. Absolutely insane. It has been lots of fun.
Yes, lots of fun, if not challenging at certain times. We have covered a wide range of topics with a fantastic lineup of guests. So we here at Press the Button want to thank listeners for joining us each and every week. And to mark this milestone episode, as we are now 1 year into this brutal and unjust conflict in Ukraine, we are bringing you a special report on Ukraine.
And as our listeners know, since Russia invaded Ukraine 1 year ago, the risk of nuclear war is higher than at any time since the Cold War, with Moscow's nuclear threats making the risks all too clear. And I have to say, I don't agree with the narrative that the risk is declining. I think, if anything, the more Russia loses, the more the risk goes up. But we'll talk more about that to come. And Russia, of course, has just announced the suspension of the new START treaty, the last remaining nuclear arms reduction agreement between the United States and Russia.
And the brutal war in Ukraine has shown that there is no denying that nuclear weapons have enabled Russia's war and the human toll it has exacted. So we will be bringing you conversations on these topics later in the episode. But Tom, we have some more exciting news to share with listeners, don't we?
Yes, Lauren, indeed we do. We are making some changes here at Press the Button. And to allow time to make those changes, we're going to be taking a short break, and we'll be back with you on April 16th.
Yes, Press the Button will be making the switch to a season-based podcast, and the overarching topic of season 1 will be marginalized voices.
Things may be sounding a little different here at Press the Button, but we are the same podcast that you know and love, just with some new twists.
Yes, so please stay tuned to our social media accounts for updates on season 1. Our Twitter is at PressButtonPod, and our Instagram is at PressTheButtonPod. So turning to this week's episode, Tom, what did you discuss on your segment for the Ukraine special?
Well, thanks. For my segment, I sit down with Rose Gottemoeller to talk about the New START treaty and Russia's move to suspend the treaty, and how this appears to have everything to do with the war in Ukraine and very little to do with starting a new arms race. It was an honor to talk with Rose, who has firsthand knowledge of this process, as she was the chief U.S. negotiator for the New START talks with Russia. It's a great conversation, so please stick around. And Lauren, what else do you have lined up for the other segment of our Ukraine special?
Alex Hall spoke with Andrea Gittleman, the policy director at the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide, to discuss how, after the 1 year mark of Russia's war in Ukraine has passed, we cannot deny the fact that nuclear weapons have enabled Russia to violate human rights in Ukraine. It was an important conversation that talks about this aspect of the war.
And as always, if you like what you hear, please remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Hall with Plowshares Fund, and you're listening to Press the Button. As we enter the second year of Russia's brutal war in Ukraine, there is no denying that nuclear weapons have enabled Russia's war and the human toll it has exacted. These human costs must be considered. War crimes and human rights abuses have been carried out under the threat of nuclear use alone. On this 200th episode of Press the Button, I'm thankful to be joined by Andrea Gittleman, the policy director at the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Thank you so much for joining me, Andrea.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
Let's start with what we have bared witness to this past year. Can you give our listeners an overview of the war crimes and crimes against humanity that have occurred in Ukraine?
The invasion, of course, is just past the 1-year mark. And as we enter the second year, there has just been an immeasurable toll that has been extracted from the Ukrainian civilian population. So you mentioned war crimes and crimes against humanity, and these are crimes that shock the conscience. They are mass atrocity crimes. We've seen these since the start of the conflict a year ago. So war crimes and crimes relating to killing, to torture, forced deportation, crimes of sexual violence, attacks on objects, facilities that should have protection during warfare. We've also seen crimes against humanity, and I think that's significant because it shows that these attacks on civilians are not incidental, they're not accidents, it's not a result of a few bad actors. What we've really seen is this widespread systematic campaign against the Ukrainian population on the part of Russian forces. And so when we think about crimes against humanity, we've seen crimes of murder, extermination, torture, imprisonment, crimes of rape and sexual violence, deportation, forcible transfer, persecution, and pretty much all of the enumerated crimes under the definition of crimes against humanity is nearly what we're seeing in Ukraine today. And I think what's useful, instead of kind of matching up legal definitions and trying to be really exacting, I think what's important is trying to remember the real world harm that this is inflicting on entire communities. So on men, women, and children, families who have been torn apart, families who have been forced to flee, and honestly, families staring down at least the near future when these crimes are likely to continue.
Thank you for that overview. It's extremely devastating, and I think you're precisely right that we have to look at this issue as a whole and take into consideration what this is doing on the broad scale to the people of Ukraine and the future of the Ukrainian population. Why is it so difficult to investigate these human rights abuses and war crimes during ongoing conflict? And how is the international community trying to do this and trying to collect evidence now for potentially future use in effort for justice?
It's often difficult to document mass atrocity crimes during conflict. Those are often for logistical reasons. There are security issues, of course, there's access issues. It's difficult to verify some information. Victims or witnesses might have fled. They might be reluctant to talk about what has happened or share information. And there were cases, from last spring where we saw evidence of mass atrocities only following Russian retreat from those areas. But evidence collection is still, of course, possible in areas of ongoing armed conflict. So Ukraine, I think, is particularly well known for open source investigations where there's information that might be publicly available. And a lot of groups, Ukrainian civil society, extremely capable in that regard, and international groups are providing good services and support as well to try to piece together information based on what is available. I also think in Ukraine, you have a relatively unique situation where local or domestic prosecutions are possible and are certainly underway, where the prosecutor general and prosecutors across the country have the ability to bring forward cases. And there's international support for those efforts to help with those prosecutions. There's support on the investigation side. And it's relatively unique because in a number of places, including, places, whether there's armed conflict or not, but places where civilians are experiencing mass atrocities, it's rare to have a local jurisdiction that has the willingness and the infrastructure to take forward those kinds of cases. So with, international support and a lot of assistance from Ukrainian civil society and the Ukrainian government, a lot of these cases can move forward.
Given that this war is being waged under the cover of Russia's nuclear arsenal, are there any heightened risks of engaging in these collection efforts, these efforts for justice, under the nuclear threat? And is this something that the transitional justice community or people such as yourselves that are working in the human rights space are concerned of when they think about how this conflict might end and the tensions that could arise down the line?
So those are good questions. Nuclear weapons are terrifying, and the specter of nuclear war, I think, is very much front of mind. I think when we adopt an atrocity prevention lens, we should always think a few steps ahead. So with any kind of response or with any effort to mitigate harm against civilians and for any effort to promote justice, it's helpful to think a few steps ahead. And so that's useful not only when we think about justice efforts. I think big picture, though, we've seen the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government show incredible resolve in fighting back and in protecting their homeland. And they are well aware that Russia is a nuclear power, and yet they are dedicated to protecting their country. And so I think the vector, that the cover of nuclear weapons is, informing some military actions, but certainly has not, I think, dampened the desire of the Ukrainian people to protect their communities. I think this question about what does the threat of nuclear weapons mean for the pursuit of justice, it's an important question to ask, and I think it certainly should be front of mind. But there are some other questions that I think we need to ask as well, and that the answers, I think, may change over time. But I think it's also important to think about both the short and long-term impacts that pursuing justice might have on the conflict, on the actions of the perpetrator, and on global peace and security, honestly, thinking big picture about that. How will other perpetrators respond? Are there potential perpetrators who might be wondering about what the commitment to justice will be, either by Ukrainians or by the international community? How will that shape their future considerations? And so there are a lot of atrocity prevention questions that I think have to be asked. And the most important question, I think, to help guide what kind of justice efforts move forward or what the international community might support would be, what are victims and survivors from Ukraine demanding? And I think the victim and survivor groups are best placed to pursue justice for the long term. And they are certainly familiar with the brutality of their foe. And they, I think, understand this perhaps better than anyone. And kind of taking a read of what victim and survivor groups and those working on their behalf are pressing for in terms of justice might help guide how the international community will best support them.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Those are vital questions. And just finally, what do you think the U.S. can better do to adopt an atrocity prevention lens in this conflict?
I think the U.S. and many others across the world are watching what's happening in Ukraine very much on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And I think that's normal and understandable when you have a conflict of this intensity. I think in order to adopt more of an atrocity prevention lens, it's helpful to think several months into the future, because there might be steps, if taken now, that could protect civilians, months ahead, thinking about the potential course of the conflict, thinking about how perpetrator motivations or capabilities might change, thinking about what victims and survivors might need and how their requirements might change. I think those are questions that will help better inform an atrocity prevention lens. And it's difficult, I think, when the day-to-day is so demanding to think more into the future, but I think that could be helpful. I think there could be, effective measures, if adopted or considered now, that might pay off down the road.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This is a really, really important conversation to be having, and I'm glad that we're bringing it to our listeners. So thank you so much for your time and for all of the work you and your partners are doing in the atrocity prevention space.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, this is Ben Rhodes. I'm very proud to be a member of the board of Plowshares Fund, where I've been for the last few years after working closely with Plowshares during my 8 years in the Obama White House. We are lucky at Plowshares to have the very, very extraordinary leadership of Emma Belcher. So I'd urge you to support Plowshares Fund and all the good work that they do to try to promote a more peaceful world with less nuclear weapons that is safer for our children and grandchildren. Thanks so much for listening.
1 year after ordering the invasion of Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Moscow would suspend its participation in the New START Treaty, the last remaining nuclear arms reduction agreement between the United States and Russia. President Biden has called this Russian move a big mistake. According to Putin, Russia is not withdrawing from the treaty, and it will continue to abide by the treaty's limits on nuclear weapons. But Moscow will not allow inspections required by the treaty, which expires in 3 years. And U.S.-Russian talks on a new agreement to replace New START have been derailed by the war in Ukraine. In fact, Russia's actions on New START appear to have as much to do with Ukraine as they do with nuclear weapons. Russia is seeking to use New START as a way to get the United States to stop supporting Ukraine rather than seeking any nuclear advantage, at least so far. Today we're joined by Rose Gottemoeller, a lecturer at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. And she has served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and she was the chief U.S. negotiator of the New START Treaty. Rose, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
So, troubled times on New START, but before we get to that, I wanted to get your sense of how Russia is using nuclear weapons in this conflict, in the war in Ukraine. What role are nuclear weapons playing in this crisis?
It actually started back in 2014 when the Russians invaded Crimea, the first phase of this invasion of Ukraine. And at that time, Vladimir Putin started rattling the nuclear saber, threatening to use all available means if the West, if NATO, if the United States should in any way block his takeover of Crimea. This behavior has only been exacerbated during this war in Ukraine over the last year. It's interesting that Vladimir Putin doesn't mention the word nuclear weapons. He allows his deputies, he allows others to talk about specific nuclear threats. But again, he repeats quite frequently, we will use all available means. This is not a bluff. You know what I mean, et cetera, et cetera. And then somebody like Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and former prime minister of Russia, comes out and says it's all about nuclear holocaust. So it's very, very concerning, of course, and the United States has been very clear officially from the president on down that this is egregious behavior and is unwarranted behavior, but we will deter, as we need to, Russia in this context, the nuclear context, as well as the conventional context.
Now, when you think about how nuclear weapons are being used in the war in Ukraine, what kind of precedents do you see being set here for future conflicts? Are there lessons being learned, both good and bad? What are the things that you worry about that we might see in future conflicts?
I think Putin's behavior is so dangerous because it actually is impinging on the nuclear taboo that has existed since the United States used the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, but it's also impinging on the taboo on a kind of casual treatment of nuclear threats that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I cannot hide that during the Cold War, from time to time, the United States and USSR traded nuclear threats, but that behavior in general has been seen as dangerous and not really something to be contemplated because weapons that are nuclear weapons are existential in nature. They could pose an extinction event for all of mankind. And so for that reason, generally speaking, both US and Russian leaders have been very cautious, and other leaders around the world have been very cautious about using nuclear threats, with the exception of that famous nuclear pariah state that is the DPRK, North Korea. And so honestly, it's quite disturbing now to see the Russian president descend to the level of a nuclear pariah like Kim Jong-un.
Now let's get to the subject at hand, which is the New START Treaty, which, as we mentioned, Russia has suspended its participation. Why, in your view, is Russia doing this, and why now?
I want to stress that I do think this is coming from the Kremlin. What has happened is that the United States and Russian Federation, they suspended the on-site inspections under New START during the COVID pandemic in June of 2020. This past year, in June of 2022, the United States said, okay, now we can deal with the pandemic, the remnants of the pandemic, let's get back to inspections. And the Russians refused to do so, but there was careful work going on behind the scenes, technical work, to get back to the regular course of inspections, to hold a meeting of the BCC, the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the implementation body of the treaty. So I could see that the Russian interagency was assiduously working toward a resumption of inspections and a resumption of full implementation of the treaty when, boom, at the end of November, this past year, 2022, all of a sudden the word came down, evidently directly from the Kremlin, to pull the plug on the meeting and not carry it forward. And afterwards, it's only gotten worse with this decision to cease implementation of the treaty and suspend the treaty from the Russian side. So I think it's coming from the top. I don't think it's coming from the Russian people or necessarily other elements of the Russian government. But of course, it is an order of the president. So here we are. We are in a place where this is not in the interest of the Russian Federation, because they're losing the predictability they had into the U.S. nuclear force posture, just at a time when the United States is embarking on a major modernization of our nuclear triad. So, Tom, I've crammed a lot into that answer. If you want to pick any of it apart, you're welcome to. But I really do believe that this is not in the interest of the Russian Federation as a whole, but the Russian president doesn't see it that way. He's trying to link it all to Ukraine.
So that's what I wanted to follow up with you and say, clearly to me, I think you would agree, this is very much about Ukraine, not so much about gaining any kind of nuclear advantage over the United States, at least not so far. In your view, will this work? Will this change the U.S. position on Ukraine?
Absolutely not. Mallory Stewart, the Assistant Secretary for Arms Control Verification and Compliance, just spoke at the Brookings Institution, and she was very clear and unequivocal that there can be no leverage here on Ukraine. The United States of America and its NATO allies and partners, we are really committed to Ukraine and continuing to support them in their fight against Russia following this invasion of Ukraine a year ago. And so there will be, I think, no opportunity from the United States point of view, for Russia to gain any leverage on this matter by suspending New START.
Now, some people looking at this might say, well, it could have been even worse than this, right? Russia is not withdrawing. Russia is saying that they will continue to respect the central limits of the treaty. In other words, not increase their arsenal beyond the limits that exist in the treaty. What do you make of that? Why is Russia suspending, not withdrawing? Why is Russia respecting the central limits?
Well, clearly, Putin is seeking leverage on Ukraine and trying to do that by suspending the treaty. But I think he also recognizes that it is in Russian interest not to see a complete demise of limits on strategic nuclear forces in the United States of America. And again, particularly at a time when the United States is embarking on a nuclear modernization and will have more capacity and capability in the coming years to upload more warheads on its strategic nuclear intercontinental missiles, whether sea-based or land-based. I think there is obviously a shred of recognition that this treaty is in Russia's strategic interest, and so Russia should remain under the limits of the treaty in the hope that the United States will remain under the limits of the treaty.
And what do you make about the Russian accusations, one, that the U.S. isn't allowing them to do inspections here, or that the U.S. is also in violation of the treaty in terms of conversions of the things that they would like to see or have more confidence are being converted? What do you make of the Russian accusations here?
Patently nonsense. And again, I would refer people to watch on YouTube the Brookings speech by Mallory Stewart. She did a great job laying out everything that the United States did to work through all the procedures that would be required for the Russians to be able to travel freely and safely to the United States, for the inspectors to get into the country, no visa barriers there, no flight barriers there, and all the conditions are intact for Russia to be able to conduct inspections in the United States of America. And furthermore, the Russians do have some implementation concerns with regard to the United States. They have to do with the conversion of sea-launched ballistic missile tubes on submarines and also heavy bombers, conversion of heavy bombers. And the way for them to have those concerns assuaged is for them to come and conduct inspections both at a submarine base and also at a bomber base in order that the United States can show them how much we are willing to assuage their concerns and really try to solve the questions they have about U.S. compliance with the conversion elements of the New START treaty.
And in that case, for the Russians to see all the steps the United States has made to try to address Russia's concerns, they would have to agree to come and do an inspection.
We could talk ourselves blue in the face, but until they can come and see with their own eyes, boots on the ground, as we always say, in the end of the day, boots on the ground and eyes on the object that is being constrained by the treaty, that's how really the final knowledge can come that a violation is not occurring.
Let's talk about replacing New START, because as we all know, this treaty expires in 3 years. It cannot be extended. There had been a process to try to discuss a follow-on agreement. That process has been derailed by the war in Ukraine. In your view, what are the prospects for getting some kind of agreement? What are the challenges? And how do we get this going before New START expires?
Well, obviously, the main barrier now is a political one coming on high from the Kremlin. And if the Russian Federation is not fully implementing the New START treaty, then, proceeding to negotiate on a follow-on treaty doesn't make sense. So the first step is for the Russians to resume full implementation of the New START treaty. But already before the war in Ukraine, the shape or the framework for the next treaty was beginning to take shape. The United States for a long time, and this went back to the Trump administration, I think these same objectives are shared by the Obama administration, and that is to get constraints on all warheads. The United States very concerned about the numbers of non-strategic nuclear warheads that the Russians possess, so get constraints on all warheads, strategic and non-strategic, deployed and non-deployed, in a single limit. And so that's a top-line objective. The second top-line objective of the United States is to get constraints on the so-called Russian exotic systems, the new delivery vehicles that have been tested and begun deployment in recent years. Now, I want to underscore, Tom, that two of those systems, the so-called Sarmat heavy ICBM, which is actually not so exotic, it's a replacement for the SS-18, a much older intercontinental ballistic missile, but also the Avant-Garde, which is a hypersonic glide vehicle. These two systems are already subject to the constraints of the New START treaty. So we're really talking about the nuclear-propelled sea launch systems that are out there. There are two of those, and the air-launched ballistic missile, the Kinjal. So those are the two top-line objectives, warheads and exotic systems on the U.S. side. I think, given past experience, we can have in mind what the Russian top objectives are. They probably want to get constraints on U.S. missile defenses. They probably want to get constraints on so-called prompt global strike, which are conventionally armed, strategic range, long-range systems. They probably have some concerns about what they see with U.S. modernization and bring up some issues in that regard. But clearly, we haven't had a chance to sit down and scope out what their concerns are. But as I wrap up this response, I'd just like to emphasize that these treaties are completely reciprocal, and that is how they come to be in the interest equally of both parties. So, of course, their objectives are not going to match up with ours, but it's by working through, balancing those objectives on both sides that we get to, I think, a place where we are equally well served in our national security by these treaties.
Now, let me go back to one of the points you made, which is that we can't really go on to the conversation about the follow-on treaty until we get New START back up and running. And of course, I understand the logic of that, both technically, politically, legally, all the rest. What if we're in a situation where we can't get that to happen, yet there is Russian interest to talk about a follow-on treaty? So we're in a situation where we would have potential to talk about a follow-on agreement, but that New START kind of stays in this limbo status that it is now. Would that work, or are you pretty much saying, no, we can't go beyond that until we get New START back in compliance?
Yeah, I think that's going to be all important. Politically, the barriers will be too high on the U.S. side, and I don't think it's in either country's interest. Once again, the Russians need to get their inspectors back into the United States at our strategic forces bases to do the inspections, and they need to resume sending the notifications about the movements of their strategic forces, and then we will be sending them our notifications as well. That's the weirdest thing about this, that they are losing all of the predictability that they gained from the New START treaty about 24/7 what's going on in the U.S. strategic nuclear force posture. So it's a weird situation, but I hope that they will see it in their interest soon to get back into the treaty. In the meantime, though, I don't foresee negotiating about a follow-on unless they are coming back into full compliance with the treaty.
Now, given Russia's position, or seemingly increasing position, that Ukraine is really the only thing that matters to Russia and everything else is kind of expendable, how do we get Putin to talk with us about arms control? And of course, there are also outside critics that will say you shouldn't talk with Putin about arms control in a time of crisis like this. What are your views on that? Clearly, there are Cold War precedents to talking to Russia about arms control in times of crisis. So give us your reflections on that.
At the moment, quite frankly, I think it's the Russians and Putin himself who are placing blocks in the way by really stating that they don't want to talk to us. Lines of communication are shut down. The United States, to my mind, has been very clear and, again, very unequivocal that we are ready at any time to talk about the New START treaty, resuming implementation of the New START treaty, and really talking about the importance of arms control. So I think at the moment, I would put the burden on the Russian side to state some readiness to resume talking and talking at a high level. That said, you ask, how do we get Putin engaged again on this? And here, Of course, we can continue to message that we are ready to interact with them, but I think it's also going to be important for third countries around the world to speak up and talk about the global strategic importance of the New START treaty. And I was very glad to see that the Chinese foreign minister and the foreign ministry itself have come out publicly and said that, first of all, there should be no thought of nuclear use in the Ukraine crisis. That is super important coming from Beijing and from other international leaders like Prime Minister Modi as well. Both President Xi and Prime Minister Modi spoke about this to Putin directly back at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit meeting in November. So that was very valuable and continues to be valuable. But the other thing that the Chinese have been doing, Foreign Minister Wang Yi speaking at the Munich Security Conference, and then afterwards, at the time of the suspension of the New START treaty, the foreign ministry coming out and saying that this is not in anyone's interest and that all parties should return to full implementation as soon as possible. I thought that this public messaging was very, very important, and I hope countries around the world, from China across the board, are speaking privately also to the Kremlin and to the Russian Federation about the importance of this treaty for the global community.
And you mentioned how, the Biden administration's position that they're open to resuming talks with Russia on New START, almost kind of anytime, anywhere, which I think is terrific. But what would you say to critics of that, who would say the United States shouldn't be talking to Putin, even if Putin wanted to talk about New START? And we've even seen some people so far as to say the United States should respond to the Russian suspension by a U.S. suspension or a U.S. withdrawal. What do you think the correct U.S. response is here?
Well, I always get really impatient with people who consider negotiation a reward for bad behavior. You talk to the good as well as the bad. If we only negotiated with our friends, we would never get anywhere. Hostage negotiators do this. You may find the dreadful terrorist who is holding a hostage at gunpoint, somebody you don't want to talk to, but you still want to get that hostage freed, right? So I like to quote John F. Kennedy, who said, "We must never negotiate from fear, but we must never fear to negotiate." And I do think that it is part of our toolbox. It's not our only toolbox, but we should never treat negotiation like it's a reward for bad behavior, because it's not. We have to negotiate to achieve what we need to achieve without resorting to the use of force. That's something my old friend from the NATO headquarters days, Jamie Shea, said repeatedly, and I really think it's a great line.
Now, if we can't get back to a full agreement on a follow-on agreement before New START expires in 2026, are there steps we can take to fill the potential gap there, right? Are there things that both sides can do to prevent all rules being removed in an interim period where we don't have any agreement in force?
I can refer you to the precedent that was out there, which would be a continuation of the reality today. That is, that we would continue to abide by the limits while a new treaty or an agreement was being negotiated. That's what happened when START went out of force in December of 2009. We did not actually finish the treaty till April of 2010, and then it took another 8 months for the treaty to be ratified, or advice and consent of the Senate for ratification could be received in the United States. And then the treaty did not actually enter into force until February of 2011. So during that period, we continued to abide by the limits. So there's plenty of precedent there. But I will say, if 2026 comes around and there's no movement on this issue from the Russian side, by that time, the United States is going to be, first of all, well into its modernization, but also contemplating what the Chinese are up to. Already, people are concerned about the rapid fire modernization of the Chinese nuclear arsenal. And so we'll have to definitely be scrutinizing what the Chinese are up to and considering how much we can pursue further limits with the Russian Federation, given, again, Chinese modernization and increase in its nuclear arsenal. So I think that I certainly hope that we'll see the Chinese more willing to discuss their nuclear modernization with us, to be more open and predictable about what their plans and objectives are with regard to their nuclear arsenal. And I hope also that we'll be able in that period of time over the next few years to engage in more nuclear risk reduction activities with the Chinese. But that is the big unknown here, Tom. And I think what will flavor the discussions with the Russians going up to 2026, but also beyond, how much is the Chinese nuclear arsenal going to have to be taken into account by the U.S.?
And Rose, last question for you. When you look at those risks of what is China doing, what will Russia do, and we could foresee a possibility of going into a period where there is no formal treaty process if we don't get a follow-on to New START, what are the risks here? And do you see that one of those risks is this is essentially the end of bilateral arms control?
Oh, I think that risk is certainly there. And to me, it's an enormous shame because since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and USSR, now Russian Federation, have been working steadily, sometimes with ups, sometimes with downs. There have been some down periods before, but we have managed to continue on a trajectory, a downward trajectory in terms of our strategic nuclear force postures. So we started with the SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, in 1972, and then we moved on to the START Treaty in the 1980s, early 1990s. Then after that, we had the Moscow Treaty, which continued to reduce numbers, and finally the New START Treaty. So we've gone from when START entered into force in 1994, each of us had approximately 12,000 weapons deployed. And under the START Treaty, we came down to 6,000. And then under the Moscow Treaty, we came down to 2,200 deployed warheads. And now under New START, down to 1,550 deployed warheads. So we have come an enormous distance in reducing and limiting nuclear weapons. And I think, we need to continue that. It's part of our obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to continue to move toward nuclear disarmament. As President Obama used to like to say, not in my lifetime. I don't believe it'll be in my lifetime either, but we need to continue on that downward trajectory. And that goes for everybody, including other nuclear weapon states, such as the Chinese.
Rose, thank you so much. I want to really give you all of our gratitude for all the work you did in creating the New START Treaty and getting it up and running. We really owe you a lot of thanks for that. And here's to hoping we can get Russia back into compliance with New START and keep this process going. So again, thanks so much and best of luck in all your work.
You're welcome, Tom. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyric Spawn and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.